Thank you for joining us. My name is Georgette Vigil. I'm the Senior Director for Alumni Engagement and Outreach at Colorado Law. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that the University of Colorado sits upon land within the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Peoples territories. Further, we acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. During the presentation, you can ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We are crowdsourcing questions, and you can upvote questions that interest you the most. Professor Deb Cantrell will respond to questions following the presentation. As a reminder, everyone is on mute. Dean Anaya has been the Dean of Colorado Law since 2016. He's an internationally recognized scholar and author in the areas of international human rights and issues concerning Indigenous peoples. He served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2008 to 2014. In addition to his teaching and scholarship, Dean Anaya has litigated major cases involving Indigenous peoples, human rights in domestic and international tribunals. I want to take a moment to recognize Dean Anaya, as this is his last Colorado Law Talk. As Dean, I want to thank him for his vision and for this Colorado Law series that has become a strong tradition at Colorado Law. Please join me in welcoming Dean Anaya.
Thank you, Georgette. And hello, everybody. Welcome to this installment of Colorado Law Talks, this time featuring Professor Deborah Cantrell, who will speak on exploring transformative silence and a protest. Colorado Law's mission includes providing exceptional legal education and engaging in research and producing influential scholarship with impact in the real world. And this scholarship, of course, advances our public service mission. We launched the Colorado Law Talks series in 2017 to share the groundbreaking research and knowledge and ideas of the Colorado Law faculty with the broader legal community in the Denver area. And in fact, we physically went to Denver to hold the talks at various venues throughout the downtown area usually. But once we went remote last year because of the pandemic, as everybody else did, we expanded the reach of the series to the legal community throughout the state and beyond. And the participation in the Colorado Law Talk series has since then been phenomenal, with participation, like I said, from throughout the state and many parts of the country and internationally at times. This is the last of the Colorado Law Talks for this academic year, as well as Georgette said, the last one I'll be presiding over. And we're very happy that you're joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to now introduce a friend and colleague, Deborah Cantrell, who is Professor of Law, Director of Clinical Programs, and the Shadden Chair in Experiential Learning at the Law School. Deb's work focuses on issues related to lawyers and social change, including the way in which lawyers rely on value systems to create and understand their roles and to develop practical wisdom. She's written especially about lawyers and religious value systems, and is one of the only few legal scholars to examine Buddhist normative principles and practices as they might apply to lawyering in the United States. Her work is truly innovative, as you'll see this evening. Professor Cantrell is a graduate of the University of Southern California, and she joined our faculty in 2009. And you can find more about her impressive background in the detailed biography that's been made available to you. It's my pleasure to now turn the program over to Professor Deb Cantrell. Deb.
Thank you so much, Jim, and welcome everybody. I have to say, I know many of you, if not all of you, spend a lot of time on Zoom, and for you all to take time to join another Zoom, I'm grateful for that. I appreciate your stamina. One of the wonderful things about Zoom is what Jim mentioned, right? Is that we have a broader reach, and there are ways in which we get to connect that we wouldn't if we were only doing this in a physical location. I will tell you, I do yearn for the physical location, just as we were all standing here. As everybody came in, I stood in silence in my office. And I saw the irony in that as I'm getting ready to talk about silence, that I was taking some time in silence. Jim, let me add my thanks to those that Georgette already said. You're in the home stretch of your deanship. It's been a remarkable time. You have really seen this law school through some extraordinary challenges, and we've flourished under your watch. And I'm delighted that I get to close out the Colorado Law Talks under your watch. But thank you for your leadership, your vision, and for seeing us through to safer times. Georgette, Yesenia, thank you as well for helping me get ready. Your prowess is most welcome, and I've appreciated the guidance. All right, I'm going to share my screen now. So just a moment. Okay. And of course, just a moment. When
Deb, you'll select at the top ribbon slideshow, and then from there start.
Yeah, what is happening is that the dialog box for screen sharing is blocking that. And I can't seem to just move this a bit so that I could now either maximize. Okay, hang on, let me just try this all again. And if I can't get it up this time, so be it. You will not have to see. All right, thanks for being patient with me as I got that going. As Jim said, I'm going to talk to you about my recent work, which focuses on transformative silence and protest. But that work draws on several strands from other research and writing that I've done. So I thought it would be helpful if I took about a handful of minutes just to give you some background and lay out some of the foundation from my prior work that I'm going to rely on tonight. So as Jim mentioned, generally my research focuses on social change and social activism and social movements. And I've been particularly interested in the role of lawyers who participate in social movement work. And I'm often looking at how lawyers bring different value systems to bear on their activist work and how they situate and describe their work, particularly in contrast to more typical lawyering settings, like working at a law firm or working as in-house counsel. And in the last handful of years, I've also been investigating how emotions are integrated into social activism, because I'm really intrigued by the dynamism I see in how activists, including lawyers, think about emotions and social change. For example, I'm intrigued by the fact that lots of activists, including lawyers, say that they're motivated to do their work because they're angry, and they think their anger helps them actually create social change. So just think right now, what images or thoughts have come to your mind because I've tied social activism and anger together? Do you expect activists to be angry? Do you have quick, almost instinctive thoughts about whether anger is good or bad or neutral? Now, sociologists call that experience that you've just had emotional labor. And that's just a way of capturing a set of expectations about how we're supposed to respond to events, right? To simplify a bit, we know that we're supposed to be happy at a birthday party and sad at a funeral. And when we're at one of those events, we do emotional labor to demonstrate the features of the right emotion we're supposed to be experiencing. We smile, we close down our body language, happy, sad, right? That's emotional labor. And in some of my previous work, I've looked at the emotional labor that's typical in activism. And as I just said, anger is probably the most common emotion that's associated with social activism. The challenge with anger, though, is that it's often tied to the idea of what political philosopher Martha Nussbaum has called the payback wish, right? That's the idea that the goal of anger is that the person you're angry with should suffer, and that's how things are made better for you. When you're angry, you have a payback wish. And I've argued that in social movement work, anger usually doesn't lead to changes that help a community thrive and flourish, right? Payback just makes a set of choices about whose ox gets gored. It sees the problem in zero-sum terms. And I've suggested that it would be better to replace anger as the emotion of protest with the emotion of injustice. Now, I appreciate we don't usually think of injustice as an emotion, but I'm trying to capture the idea of an emotion that calls out wrongs in the world, but asks for them to be rectified not by payback, but by remedies that bring benefits across the community. In other words, I want to try and find a way that rejects zero-sum thinking and instead looks for options for mutual gain. All right, that's the background. So let me move now to my current work. In my current work, I've been exploring how our experiences of emotion and emotional labor always happen within a web of relationships. I seldom do emotional labor on my own, right? I almost always am doing emotional labor by thinking about the other people involved, right? The web of relationships that are going to experience and assess my emotional labor. For example, when I'm working as a social movement lawyer, I'm thinking about how my expressions of emotions will impact my social movement colleagues, my social movement opponents, as well as others who might be monitoring my work, like law enforcement or legislators, or just the general public. So today I'm going to focus on my recent work looking at the role of silence in social protest. And while I appreciate that we might not ordinarily think of silence, just like we don't think of injustice as an emotion, we might not think of silence as an emotion, I think it's pretty straightforward to see how silence is a way of doing emotional labor. Silence is a way of expressing a message that includes emotion. For example, silence can signal anger. It can signal fear. It can signal distrust, or it can signal respect or awe. The main questions I want to consider with you all tonight are, what are our starting presumptions about what protest looks like? Speaking up, keeping quiet, angry, frustrated, motivated by one's inner self, by others. How can seeing that our choices about how to act always involve a web of relationships help us make clearer and better choices? And finally, do other disciplines understand silence in ways that social activists could benefit from? And here I'm going to look to some religious contemplative traditions. But first, let's start with some images about what protest looks like. Ferguson, Missouri, after the murder of Michael Brown. Minneapolis, Minnesota, after the murder of George Floyd. GLSEN's Day of Silence. This is a group that works particularly with LGBTQ students in educational settings, and it hosts each year a day of silence where students pledge to be silent throughout an entire day to acknowledge silencing that happens to LGBTQ peers, and then they break their silence at the end of day. And this image from 1917, this is from an NAACP march known as the Silent March. It was held in New York City in order to protest unrest in East St. Louis, where white union members had moved into an African-American neighborhood, killing people and looting and rioting in order to punish that community for breaking a picket line. Did you notice from the 4 images that I showed you that we often think about protest in 2 contradictory ways? It's loud and protesters are agitated or angry, or it's quiet and protesters are silent and calm. Now, of course, when we take a moment to reflect, we know that those quick characterizations are too simplistic, but I think it's easy for both protesters and those observing to get stuck in those quick simplistic views. And what I think happens then is that the conversation turns too easily away from the actual substantive issues that are being protested about to whether the means of protest are justified or not. And I worry that that change of focus reduces the effectiveness of protest by changing the conversation to be about whether protesters are good or bad people, not whether the issues have merit or not. Or it changes the conversation to whether or not responding law enforcement are good or bad people and the like. Instead of focusing on the substantive issues, we start to think about people and we make individual judgment calls about whether they are good people or bad people. So would it matter in how we think about protest and protesters if we understood how relational protest really is? Like I just said, when we see protests, I think it's easy to start thinking about the individual protesters and to start making assessments about whether someone is a good person or a bad person. But if we pay attention to the fact that protest always involves a dynamic web of interpersonal relationships, I think that might help us avoid moving into those simplistic assessments. Think about it. If I'm a protester, I make choices about whether to speak up or be silent by considering how others respond to those choices, or by estimating how I want others to respond, or by assessing what kinds of consequences will come about because of my choices. Right? Emotional labor. I do emotional labor in this web of relationships. And I'm also often having to think about the law and how it is choosing to order protest relationships. For example, how easy is it for my protest group to get a permit to march? What do I know about the law enforcement I might encounter and how that group has responded to similar kinds of protests in the past? Do I know whether they're going to be counter protesters? And do I have any expectations about how they're going to be treated? All of those kinds of factors are likely the kinds of things that go into my own assessment about whether I'm going to speak out during protest or I'm going to be silent, or whether I need to let others speak out, or whether I need to be part of a silent protective ring around my colleagues who are going to speak out. And I'm not only thinking about the practical choices I have to make in light of the law. I'm also thinking about the law structurally and systemically. And here I think we've seen this profoundly in the Black Lives Matter movement and in some of those protests. For example, I think we've seen Black Lives Matter protesters make choices about actions that they hope will bring attention not just to individual racist actions, but to structural racism as well. So think about protests where a road or a freeway is blocked, right? And the intent of that is to upset the daily routines of the community as a way of sending a message about how embedded structural racism is throughout our ordinary days, right? It says, in your ordinary day, right, a protester to me, a white person, in your ordinary day, you expect that you'll be able to drive around unimpeded. But in my ordinary day, structural racism means I don't get to drive around unimpeded. And the protest choice to block the road and to speak up and out to those in power is to say to those in power, you disrupt my life every day through structural racism. Now experience the disruption yourself. Notice all of the work going in here is a kind of emotional labor that is calculated. I mean, I don't use that word in a bad sense, but it is intentional. It is thought through and thoughtful. Now, of course, protesters know that they can't control how others receive their protest choices. And that's part of the relational dynamism that I think is so important to notice. As a protester, whether I speak up or I'm silent, observers still get to make their own choices about how to respond. It's their choice whether they treat my silence as some kind of consent or disrespect, or as a refusal to concede, or as dignified, right? My emotional labor is received by somebody else who assesses that. And as I think about my own choices, I'm making them in light of predictions about others' reactions or about the law's reactions. Now, what I think the above reveals is that in our current times, right, we expect the relationality in protest to be adversarial. I'm sure that statement doesn't surprise you, especially in our current climate, where it can feel to all of us that any kind of difficult conversation is fraught. Here's another worry. I worry that one result is now protest gets seen as hyper adversarial. And once it becomes hyper adversarial, it becomes less effective, right? Both protesters and observers believe that the other side doesn't care and isn't listening anyways. That's the assumption of hyper adversarialness. And the solution here can't be just to tell somebody to listen. If you're somebody who historically has been dismissed by society, being told to listen is essentially being told to accept things as they are. Or it's akin to that phrase that I think puts a lot of us on edge when we're engaged on a topic of conversation and someone tells us to just relax. Especially for folks who identify as members of a group that has historically been marginalized, being told to listen better or just relax is like being told to keep quiet because you're in a group of people who aren't supposed to speak up. And if you're someone with privilege, right? Often when we're told to listen, we respond, we are listening. The challenge is that we don't realize often that we hear through our own experiences and privilege. For example, as a white person, I hear stories about race through my own experience as a white person. So unless I'm being quite intentional and careful, I probably don't realize how my own experiences hamper how I hear stories told by my colleagues of color. What is an everyday experience of racism for them is startling to me And I could easily dismiss it as a one-off or aberrational if I don't realize that I'm always listening through my ears of being a white person. Okay, so we've built out this idea of relationality and protest. And here's where I'm going to make an unexpected turn into contemplative practices from some faith traditions. And I'm making this move because I want to try and figure out a way to dislodge the challenges I just described about hyper-adversarialness in protest and about the challenge of listening, right? If it's the case that the solution isn't to just tell somebody to start listening, what are the other possible avenues? Just to make sure we all have some shared background knowledge about some contemplative practices from faith traditions, I'm going to take a moment to lay some foundation that I'm going to rely upon. So we have some shared material to work from. So I'm going to start with the Abrahamic traditions, where there's an idea of listening for God or for Allah. And it's a practice rooted in silence. As a contemplative practice, listening for God means moving into silence so that a person removes herself from the distractions of everyday life and truly is able to hear the divine voice. Importantly, in those traditions, I listen for God, not because I know what God or Allah is going to say, but because I'm hoping that some kind of wise knowledge will be revealed to me. I'm open to insights that can be deeply surprising and that can ask me to radically rethink my views. The well-known Catholic contemplative Thomas Merton described this kind of revelatory silence as follows. It must provide an area, a space of liberty, of silence, in which possibilities are allowed to surface and new choices beyond routine choice become manifest. It should create a new experience of time, not as stopgap stillness, but a temps vierge, not a blank to be filled or an untouched space to be conquered and violated, but a space which can enjoy its own potentialities and hopes and its own presence to itself. We can find practices similar to listening for God in other faith traditions as well. And let me turn to Buddhism and talk about that a bit. Now, I expect all of you are familiar with meditation and the idea of mindfulness. There are secular versions everywhere, and often those versions have very concrete goals: stress reduction, an ability to concentrate better, something like that. But the practice in Buddhism, like in the Abrahamic traditions, has a more aspirational, revelatory feel to it, to open one's mind so that the fundamental nature of the living world can be revealed. And again, the idea of revelation is not that I learned something I already know. It's that I'm offered the chance to gain new wisdom and new insights, whether or not that knowledge sits easily within my current view. One of the other features of what I'm calling transformative silence, and I think both the listening for God or Allah and the Buddhist version are examples of transformative silence, is that transformative silence helps us experience the interconnectedness, the relationality amongst all of us. And this idea of interconnectedness or deep relationality is common amongst faith traditions. Think about the concept from the Abrahamic traditions of love of neighbor. That comes out of this notion of relationality, right? All of us live constantly and consistently in a web of relationships. Let me take a moment to detail here what is and is not meant by the idea of love of neighbor, because I think it gets muddied in our ordinary secular usage. In faith traditions, love doesn't mean intimate love or even friendly platonic love. It really means respect for the other and the acknowledgement that every life holds dignity. And what flows from that is the understanding that if my life holds dignity, I should respect the dignity of other lives, even when I do not like the other person or I fundamentally disagree with the other person. It is an inextricable fact that I am in some kind of web of relationality with all other people. And that web has positive valence, neutral valence, and negative friction valence. To acknowledge that, right? To acknowledge that inextricable interconnectedness, that is the practice of love of neighbor. Okay, I feel like I have given you quite the smorgasbord of ideas out there, and I need to do some work to bring these strands together. So stay with me a bit longer and let me try and tie some things together and show their relationality. So I think I've demonstrated a few key points. That protest is necessarily relational. As a protester, my choices reflect how I see and understand the web of people around me, both those in support and in opposition. I think I've demonstrated that protests include choices about both speaking up and being silent. And both of those choices are ways of showing resistance to the status quo. We're in a period of time, though, where adversarialness is highlighted. We don't easily see our interconnectedness with each other. Or we see connectedness only through agreement, and we miss the connectedness that necessarily is present in disagreement as well. And to get back to the idea of emotional labor that I talked about, I think the expectations about how both protesters and opposition should feel and should show their emotions have been limited and circumscribed to being about anger and distrust. That is the only emotional labor that is expected and accepted right now in protest. So at the core, as someone who believes in the power of social activism, my worry is that social protest is losing its effectiveness in part because we've narrowed expectations about protest. My turn to contemplative traditions and the idea of transformative silence is a way to provide activists with practices that amplify the possibilities for protests to be productive. It can still be chaotic and cacophonous or silent and calm, but I want it to be productive. So first, I hope that protests could be imbued with the possibility of revelation, not in a religious talking to God or Allah sense, but in the sense of an openness to the unexpected and a willingness to adapt one's views to new information. My own experience with social change is that there never is a fixed permanent solution to any big complicated challenge. The solution always and necessarily is dynamic and changing as context changes, and as context develops. Thus, what's needed is an ongoing creative problem-solving approach, right? And that works best when people bring open and inquisitive minds to the challenge. Next, I hope that activists can embrace their fullest web of relationships, and that web includes not only allies, but those in opposition. When everyone is in the web of relationships, that helps us remind each other of every person's dignity. And I think that then helps everyone replace anger and its resulting desire for payback with an ability to speak about injustice and the resulting changes that then raise the boat for everyone, to move from zero sum to options for mutual gain. And I want to be very clear here. I am not positing that activists on opposite sides of an issue have to become friends, or even that people who come from radically different lived experiences can truly stand in the other's shoes. I am saying that activists are not served by having cookie cutter, unidimensional views of opponents. Instead, activists benefit from a clear-eyed assessment of the interests and positions of everyone in the web of relationships. At the end of the day, with much of activist work, the law doesn't change unless the relationships that the law is dealing with change first. The law doesn't lead, relationships lead. And I want to be careful not to overclaim here, because I appreciate that all of us, especially those of us lawyers in the conversation, can come up with examples of important changes in the law, either by statute or court decision, that led social change. You know, think about Loving versus Virginia and how it literally changed relationships by holding anti-miscegenation laws unconstitutional. So I appreciate that there are moments where the law can lead. But also think about how school segregation remains despite Brown versus Board of Education. Again, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is terrific to look at in terms of activists being clear-eyed about the need to change relationships in order for legal change to truly be effective. As a white person, I have appreciated current conversations by activists of color who forthrightly describe what it means from their perspective for a white person to stand in solidarity with activists of color. For example, activists of color have talked about rejecting the label of ally. As Black queer feminist Mia McKenzie has described it, ally cannot be a label that someone stamps onto you, or God forbid, that you stamp onto yourself, so you can then go around claiming it as some kind of identity. It's not an identity. It's a practice. It's an active thing that must be done over and over again in the largest and smallest ways every day. I hear McKenzie calling on relationships to change between white people and people of color as part of building out the impact of activism. And I want to be careful, right? I want to be careful here not to be heard as saying that activist movements led by people of color can't make change until the white people join in. I'm saying something else, which is that I appreciate how activists of color recognize the wider web of relationships in which they are involved, and they are engaging that wider web of relationships instead of writing it off or ignoring it. And that engagement is pointed and it's hopeful. Finally, I hope that by bringing the idea of transformative silence into protest work, the emotional labor of protest work becomes richer. Anger isn't the only emotion that activists get to show, whether anger demonstrated by speaking or anger demonstrated by silence. Activists get to show love, curiosity, resilience, trust, injustice as an emotion, distrust, but openness to engagement. Right? In the end, I think that increasing the tapestry of emotions available in social protest work will better engage the fullest web of relationships. And if you engage the fullest web of relationships, that leads to more effective change, including changes in the law. Relationships will lead here. The law then can follow. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Cantrell. I found your talk certainly very fascinating, and I feel like our minds need to open to viewing protest through that new lens and to really be adaptive. There's so much to consider as relationships lead the change. I know we already have a few questions in the queue. I'm going to start off with the first two questions together, asked by Tammy Cunin. She says, I'm intrigued by the idea of injustice as emotion. Can you talk more about that, whether there is literature about that? That's the first part of her question. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Tammy. I am making an unexpected move to claim injustice as an emotion. There isn't literature there. But what's really interesting is if you look at the literature about anger and activists and how social movement activists describe anger, you hear two different things. You hear anger, as I described it, with a payback wish. So Martha Nussbaum's idea of you suffer for in order for me to improve. But there is another version that I'm calling injustice that gets called anger. And what I want to dislodge is this idea that to speak up against wrongs in society, I want that to be something different, because typically I think a community thrives and flourishes when injustice is rectified in a way that raises things for everybody. And that doesn't mean there aren't redistributions in there, but at the end of the day, the entire floor moves up instead of just a tit for tat, you lose, I win, zero sum kind of way. So that's why I make that distinction.
Thank you. The second part, or a separate question from Tammy. In addition to protesters, those in opposition, there are neutral observers. Do neutral observers have work to do here too for protests, so that protests can be more, to be more productive?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I suppose the activist in me says, nobody gets to stay on the sidelines. Being on the sidelines and saying you're neutral is in fact an affirmative choice in support of the status quo. And so while you might not label yourself as a protester or as an activist, you've made a choice in support of something. It's what Ibram Kendi, when he talks about being an anti-racist, he makes this distinction between being a racist, and it's not the only other choice you have is to be an anti-racist, right? You don't get to stand on the sidelines, because standing on the sidelines is a choice in support of something. So I think that's how I would pull your neutrals into this, is to push them to think about whether or not they are neutral.
That makes so much sense. And you almost perfectly transitioned to the next question from one of our own law alumni board members, Velveeta Golightly Howell, who is asked something that you started to answer, and that is, how do you differentiate between the term and meaning of ally versus anti-racist?
Yeah, Velveeta, wow. You hit the nail on the head. I mean, here's where I think Mia McKenzie really has it spot on when she notes that the requirement to stand in support is a requirement about action. And this is standing in support in all sorts of ways, whether we're talking about anti-racism, whether we're talking about other anti-subordination kinds of activities. It requires conduct. It is not a label or a badge. And so The scrutiny, I think, that all of us can do, the critical eye we can turn to ourselves and our own actions is that, are we acting, and how would we assess our actions? And if our only action is to put on a label and to say we are something without doing more, that is just like the neutral observer I spoke before. It is standing, I think, in silence, and silence when you have privilege is supporting the status quo.
Wow. Okay. Our next question is from Heather Ryan. Silence seems valuable for actors in preparing themselves for social change advocacy. Can it also be a tool for advocacy when actively engaging with those on the other side?
And Heather's one of our own too. I'll just note that. So we've got lots of alums. So Heather, that's a really interesting idea, and it makes me think a couple of things. So one, I just had a quick image or revisioning of that image I put up of the 1917 NAACP Silent March, where part of the point of that march, as organizers described it, was to stand in silence in the face of the extraordinary violence that had been reaped upon the East St. Louis African American community, and to use that silence as absolutely sending a message, and a damning message, damning the atrocities, and also saying, right, the message of resilience and fortitude. And so I'm seeing some of that in your question.
Thank you for that. Our next question is from G, and that's not me. I wonder about whether words have been bastardized so much in today's era that silence has become more important and vital to the struggle.
Yeah, what a great question, G. And I love how your question is picking up on this notion of silence as a space for an openness of one's mind instead of a closing down, right? You're really suggesting that there needs to be this moment where we open our minds. We don't step in so quickly with words. And sometimes, right, who needs to be silent and for why and for what purpose can change. There may be ways I need to be silent because I have been too full of words at other moments, and I need to, in some ways, atone for that. And I'm intentionally using some religious metaphors here, not to just because we're in that sort of that space, that transformative silent space. I also want to pick up on one other piece of your question, which is just the idea of words and what words mean and how words change and how we use words. And I do think we are at a moment right now where words can be very volatile, right? So for example, I'm going to pick a phrase that I think can be volatile in different ways in different communities. So white supremacy. For some white folks, that triggers a lot of angry reaction. And for others of us, it's a naming of, a long historical set of practices. So we're going to have to figure out a way through this. And your idea of silence and taking a moment for silence is really terrific.
There's power in that silence. Erica Rogers has a question here. Do you have any examples of protest activism models that utilize a more dynamic tapestry of emotions, as you mentioned? Do you think there are some more effective than others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I gave some examples from the Black Lives Matter movement because I think there are activists who are really thinking through those issues within that movement, right? I do think the other piece that I am seeing is, many of you might be familiar with this idea of restorative justice, right? This idea that we bring people together to restore relationships. I've seen a really interesting move amongst activists to set that down and instead call for transformative justice as the way of thinking through and acknowledging that this work is always within a web of relationships, but that the web can be hostile and caustic at times. And so it may be that other kinds of relationships have to be nurtured first in order to go forward into that more caustic space. So instead of saying, let's just bring everybody together and restore, there's an idea of transforming to move into a place where the rupture might be able to be repaired better.
Thank you. I'm just marinating with that in my mind. The next question is from Jeff Esses. Do you feel protests are defined more by the protesters or the media that reports on it?
Oh, what you all have had such great questions. Yes, that's such a good observation, and right is part of the challenge and the reason we think of protest as being hyper adversarial is because it serves the media to portray it that way. And I am sure that dynamic, I'm absolutely sure that dynamic is at play. And it's not linear, right? It cycles back on itself. So when you see media make particular choices about what images they show, to G's point, what language gets used, is it protest, is it riot, is it insurrection, all of these things, that feeds back into protesters and how they are thinking about the emotional labor they're going to do, right? Do I think TV crew is going to be there or so-and-so is going to be there, and how does that impact the choice I'm going to make about what my protest is going to look like? Notice that this emotional labor, happens through the media as well.
It certainly does. I have a question that's related to Jeff's question, and that is the role of social media in protest. And obviously, social media is a different kind of noise. But any thoughts about how that can be utilized, or any thoughts around social media?
Yeah, I think, like with everything when we're engaging and trying to move something in some way, it's dynamic and it's complicated. There isn't one good thing, one bad thing, or it's not all good or all bad. It's dynamic as well. And so, right, I think that's part of why my interventions are designed to, or thinking about creating practices that we can, as social activists, use and rely on to come at this dynamism in our best, most creative, most steadfast, most clear-eyed way. So every time I choose to use social media, I'm making a choice about how I use it, for what purpose, for why, what am I trying to provoke or not. And so at least having that cogitation happen before the quick Twitter. Some people might be better than others, right? But these are habits, right? These are practices that we can cultivate. None of this is beyond anybody's reach. All of us can practice and create good habits in this regard.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I'm gonna there is one more question. Let me see here. So this message, or this question, is from Peter Hyung, if I'm I know he's a professor here. I may not be pronouncing his
You're
name
Wang.
correctly.
Hi,
Go
Peter.
ahead. Yes, thank you. This is fascinating and raises the question of, can law change people's beliefs to see others as deserving of dignity, love, and respect?
What a great question. I'm sure many of you are familiar that Peter does a lot of really interesting work in cognition and mindfulness in cognition and cognitive behavioral work. So I think of him as a real compatriot in this area. Boy, Peter, don't you wish we could actually answer that question? Because if we could, and we got a positive answer, that would be such a hopeful place to be. And I suppose, because I don't know that we will ever get to an answer, what I will stand on is the capacity for human brains to do things better. That neuroplasticity is a huge gift. And if neuroplasticity can make us better at thinking about how to lose weight or how to be less stressed, why can't it also help us think about understanding human beings as being all connected and deserving of dignity? So I'm going to stand in a place of hope.
I like that. And we'll take our final question from Stephanie Coons. Can privileged silence support, can privileged silent support transform justice? In other words, as a white privileged lesbian, my standing in silence be construed as something other than supporting the status quo?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think this is where context matters. So if you're standing in silence because you are standing around and with others who have been silenced, and your silence is a way of promoting their voice when they've not had voice, then I think your silence is hugely proactive and generative. In contrast, for example, if I stand silent when I could intercede because of my privilege, that choice to not intercede when my privilege is giving me protection and I'm using it to maintain my protective state, I worry about those moments of silence the most. It goes back a bit to Velveeta's earlier question, the difference between ally and affirmative conduct.
Thank you. I thank you for this interactive session with our audience and those thoughtful questions. I'll turn it over to Dean and Aya.
Yeah, and let me just say thank you, everybody. Those were terrific questions. Terrific questions. See, Jim, this was Colorado Law Talks has been such a great way to get us to be able to talk more.
Right. Thank you so much, Deb. Thank you, Georgette, for a terrific job moderating the questions, and thanks for all the questions. A lot to think about, as you provided these insights and gave us really lessons about how to approach protest, how to approach the movements that we want to see happen, the justice that we want to see prevail. I'm thinking, how does this work? This sensitivity to this, as you said, tapestry of emotions, the understanding the web of interrelationships that is key to moving forward. How does this work if we're so polarized? If not everybody is engaged in this way? We look at South Africa, when there was a moment of atonement, when protest did meet an opening, and there was a grand moment of atonement and coming together. Of course, there's still problems. Can we achieve that in such a polarized society here? Anyway, we're out of time, but I know that Deb, you and I will have the opportunity to talk about these things more. I've enjoyed the discussion we had on earlier on this topic when we talked about a paper that you've done on the same set of ideas. But thanks so much. Terrific talk. Great way to to cap off our Colorado Law Talks for this year and for my deanship. It'll be up to the next dean whether or not to continue them and for what format. If you have a view on that, I'm sure she'd love to hear about them, about your views. But anyway, thanks for everybody for participating in this Colorado Talk, and I know that many of you participated in previous ones. Thanks for that. Thanks for Georgette for taking the lead in organizing them, for Yesenia for being in the background, helping to make everything happen, and for our tech people for bringing us all together. Thank you all for joining us and engaging in this important discussion.